Good morning and welcome to Outsiders. Shall I compare Zier to a summer's day? They art more lovely and more gender fluid. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and global warming turns us all to climate druids. Yes, Shakespeare's Globe Theatre has decided to go woke and give trigger warnings to the audiences. What a joke. But no such political correctness or woke virtue signalling nonsense here on Outsiders, where all the world is our stage and we have a huge show lined up for you with the bard of the mastheads himself, James Morrow.
Some are born mad, some achieve madness, and some have madness thrust upon them.
And filling in for Rita, the diva of social media, Daisy Cousins.
Is this a vaccine I see before me? The needle toward my hand?
And myself, Rowan Dean. Now is the winter of our discontent, thou mad mustachioed, purple-hued maltworm. Why may even a man no longer even gaze upon a sunset?
I get sent lots of stories from lots of different people. You know, there's a whole bunch of people down the Ryback Beach last night who thought the best thing to do was to go and watch the sunset. I'm sure it was a beautiful sunset. But that's not in the spirit or in the letter of these rules.
That's right, the comedy of errors that is Australia's approach to COVID-19 carries on relentlessly. Now it is the sunsets that truly fadeth in the west. Our leaders have completely lost the plot. That one in particular, which brings us to Outsiders News. Well, Daisy, James, so much happened yesterday. Something called pepper ball rounds were fired into the crowds at a Victoria anti-lockdown demonstration. Now, I don't support people breaking the law, but nor do I support the police heavy-handedness, which includes something called pepper balls being fired at the crowd, James.
Well, yeah, look, yesterday was, I think, one of the darkest days we've had in this pandemic, not just because of the numbers of cases, which I think we're all coming to terms with the fact that cases are going to matter less and less and less, but rather in what is happening, I think, to Australian society. You know, again, don't go and protest in a pandemic. That's dumb. However, I have a huge problem with this idea that there is so little empathy for people who are pushed to the brink by these lockdowns, which in Melbourne have been going on for 200 days now. You know, until yesterday, I thought that pepper ball rounds were some delightful snack you'd get at a church fete in Minnesota. Now it turns out that they're some sort of non-lethal weapon deployed on protesters. You know, again, don't support protesting in this circumstance, but there are an awful lot of people out there who seem to be so eager to see the police come down. I saw tweets from respected people. I saw tweets from, people at the ABC say they should be locked up and, throw away the key. I saw people say, wish there were real bullets they were using. There's a real divide and a gap growing in this society. And I fear that once we get COVID over and done with, and we will, we're going to wind up with a society that's been very fractured and very traumatized because it has put so much power in the hands of people who just love seeing, the boots stuck on the neck of other people and, dobbing each other in and, controlling what other people can do. And above it all, there is, and it's summed up by what Dan Andrews was saying in that, this real sort of joylessness, don't go watch the sunset. Well, what more do you want? I mean, this is what it's all about. Every time anybody seems to want to do anything fun, that's, well, no, you can't do that. That's a risk of COVID. And there's this weird, almost, atheistic puritanism that has put COVID in this kind of almost religious sort of vein where it becomes, this thing that needs to be appeased with our sacrifice rather than something that needs to be dealt with through science.
Well, talking about the science, Daisy, I mean, it is pretty clear, it's controversial, but it is pretty clear that protesting or being outdoors, protesting might increase the risk, but there was very little evidence of that from the previous protests. Being outdoors is supposedly not somewhere that it's easy to catch the virus, but I would have thought the last thing you would want to be doing is spraying people with pepper spray or making them sneeze and cough. Any kind of reaction like that by the police would actually be raising the risk, I would have thought, of spreading any infection. But there you go. What was it like in Brisbane, Daisy?
Look, up here, protesting, I believe, is currently legal because we're not in a lockdown. So I think it was, well, at least not for now. You know, we're all just counting down the days until the next one. Of course, it will happen because that's the Australia we live in right now. But yes, I think it was a lot less dramatic than the protests in Sydney and Melbourne, thankfully. It is interesting, though, like, you know, on your point, James, about this sheer lack of empathy for the protesters. Again, like, none of us are suggesting that people should go and break the law here. Absolutely not. The problem is, though, I think the way that governments have reacted to these protesters is completely beyond the pale. And I know that we've made this point, you know, a lot of us have, a lot of the time, compared to the way they spoke about Black Lives Matter protesters last year, who were also breaking a public health order. It was, oh, they're stunning and brave, and oh, we recommend they don't, etc., etc. But here, the minute people are protesting government policy, which is what this is, they are protesting government policy that drastically affects their lives in any material way, all of a sudden they're disgusting and they're buffheads and they're careless and they're selfish and they're terrible, horrible people. And there seems to be this encouragement of public shaming of these protesters. You know, as James mentioned, the kind of comments and tweets that we've seen, it's this divide and conquer mentality that I think we are seeing from our politicians, which is an age-old political strategy designed to make people suspicious and fearful of each other. And moving forward, you know, after this, we finally leave this pandemic behind us, I think there's going to be a lot of that residual suspicion there. And I really do weep for the future because I don't know what kind of Australia we're going to emerge into once the dust finally settles on all of this.
Well, Daisy makes a really good point, James, about the Black Lives Matter protest last year. That clown Cornelius down in Victoria was out there saying, oh, no, they've got a right to protest. It's a democracy we live in. And we even saw police bending the knee, taking the knee to Black Lives Matter. But now the boot literally is on the other foot. But, James, we are seeing some interesting little kind of frictions developing. And as Daisy said, if you create this sort of divisive society, the fractures run in all the most extraordinary places. We're seeing in WA, for example, some of the police unions or members are going, well, hang on, where they're being told they all have to wear masks for 10 hours a day. They're being saying, oh, hang on, we didn't sign up for this. We've seen, I would have hoped we would have seen some police in Victoria yesterday, perhaps thinking maybe pepper ball rounds aren't quite the way to go, James.
Well, look, I think the police here have been thrust into such an invidious position in all of this. I think it's really interesting, too. You mentioned about, you know, the BLM protests in Victoria versus the way they were handled last year in New South Wales. And I think at least in New South Wales, there's been a bit of consistency on that versus the genuflection we saw in Victoria last year. That said, though, you know, it's not just about the masks in WA. It's that police and, you know, now the ADF, too, have been charged with now enforcing all of these stay-at-home orders, going and visiting people's houses, checking on them to make sure that they're not leaving. You know, I've known people and talked to people who have had these visits from the police over different infractions. The police seem to be just as tired of this, or at least many of them seem to be just as tired of this as everybody else is. You know, the going out, having to go out and hand out fines, going to hand out this and that and the other thing. It's a very tough position that they're in, and it will be interesting to see. I think the idea that the union in WA is pushing back is interesting. I suspect we're going to start to see some of that happening in the eastern states, probably particularly in Victoria, where their lockdown just makes, you know, it's just let's find every sort of thing that you can throw at it and just make the cops enforce it. The police unions don't. You know, they didn't sign up to be cops to keep people from watching the sunset. You know, exactly. That's not why they put on a uniform.
Well, in Canberra, the ACT police force is called ACT Policing.
Ooh.
So some trendy name there, but ACT Policing have come out and said that, guess what? Here's a surprise. You'd never have picked this one. All those dobbers who are dobbing in, their neighbours, are wasting police time. In fact, the police officers there are saying that they've even had someone phoning in to complain about 2 children jumping on a trampoline in their own backyard, not wearing masks. I mean, this is the sort of East German Stasi neighbour on neighbour. Daisy mentioned the suspicions, the paranoias that will linger for years and years. And at least the police are starting to recognise, hang on, maybe some of this is a waste of time. But we've also seen, for example, in St. Louis in America, I just want to go overseas for a little bit, James, we've seen there that a judge has come out and said that enforcing mask wearing under St. Louis law is illegal. James.
Yeah, that's right. And it's part of a whole trend of pushback that we're seeing around the United States to the attempts by the federal government essentially to mandate mask wearing in public spaces and in various spaces. And what's great about the United States is actually states and jurisdictions are able to and are really pushing back to retain their ability to say, no. We will manage risk in our own way here rather than having, the CDC and, the health department in Washington and the White House, which has gotten really everything right, along the way through this the last year since the Biden administration came in, and certainly has not been using COVID for political purposes at all, just so we're very clear about that. And there's pushback, and there should be, and we're seeing so much of that now, which is really, really good. And, frankly, everything that's been happening in this pandemic in Australia, we're basically a year behind the U.S. Exactly. This is a great warning, I think, to our politicians, our political leaders. We are now, we're already seeing society really starting to fracture, over the response to this. You've got the people who are doing very well and are well off out of this, people who are unaffected, and then there are people who are really doing it tough. And over the top of that, you've got people just looking to use this to, air their grievances. You talked about that one case before. I was reading just this morning coming in about an apartment block in Sydney where some little kids who lived in the block had been using that sidewalk chalk to do some rainbows and stuff on the apartment block driveway, and they got an angry letter from the Strata about it. I mean, this is just nuts.
Gosh.
But we see where we are in the U.S. That's all going to come here, and these fights between federal and state mandates, we think it's bad now. You just wait if we can't get this under control now.
Well, Daisy, shortly we'll be speaking to Campbell Newman with the Liberal Democrats. He's got announcements to make, an important announcement. I'm going to give a quick spoiler alert here. The Liberal Dems are advocating December 4th as being Freedom Day in Australia. So they're saying that's it, end of all lockdowns, end of everything. Campbell will be announcing that later in the program. But we, on this show, James, you will recall that I called for Freedom Day on May the 1st, an end to lockdown, end to restrictions on May the 1st last year. So that's how far behind we are. And we are now seeing, for example, countries like Sweden, which went through the pain. They went through all the pain. We've still yet to go through it. That lies ahead for us, and are now down to arguably zero COVID cases with no restrictions, they have safety measures, they have hygiene, they have social distancing, but they have nothing mandated, James.
Well, yeah, but, look, you said May 1. That just felt a little bit too Russian revolutionary for me. I wasn't particularly comfortable with the May Day freedom implications of that, Rowan. I don't know where you're coming from there. But that said, I was just looking London right now. Said Khan, the mayor, who we've had a lot of trouble with. Well, he's just put out a tweet just now saying London is open for business. London is back. Come on back to London. We are back getting invested. They have thousands and thousands of cases a day. It does not make the headlines in England. They have a much higher vaccination rate, absolutely. A higher herd immunity rate, absolutely. We're going to get there. Gladys Berejiklian buried the lead yesterday in her New South Wales press conference when she said that, look, with this outbreak, we are seeing far fewer hospitalizations, far fewer deaths. In other words, the virus is behaving as it's supposed to behave, and the vaccines are kicking in as they're supposed to. So, I think December 4th might be a little early with the time it takes for everybody to get, vaccinated and those to kick in. But why not make, say, January 26th, Australia Day, our new Freedom Day? That would be my proposal.
Well, we'll see what Campbell Newman has to say about that. But, Daisy, up in your neck of the woods, you've had Jeanette Young, the unelected bureaucrat who seems to think that she can defy the Australian Constitution by mandating vaccine passports on the border. That would interrupt intercourse between the states, which is against the Constitution. How does she get away with it?
Well, look, I think just she and Anastasia Palaszczuk have really done a number on the people of Queensland. They did this in the lead up to the state election last year, boy, did they use the COVID fear stick into hounding the people of Queensland into believing that and if we didn't do absolutely everything that they say and have the border closures and the restrictions and all of that, then we were going to end up like the UK with thousands of deaths and thousands of cases, etc., which of course is ridiculous. I mean, how on earth can you compare Queensland, which is massive, warm, and lots of space, to the UK, which is tiny, cramped, cold, and everyone lives on top of each other? There's just no comparison at all. But they managed to get this through Queenslanders' heads, plus the kind of toxic parochialism. She depicted the southern state as sort of leprous and COVID infected. No, oh, we don't want them here. And people who were literally frightened to death by this rhetoric coming from Jeanette Young and Anastasia Palaszczuk just bought it. So now we're in a situation where people don't even make a noise if Jeanette Young is talking about vaccine passports to cross the border, etc. It's just become so totally normalized with so many people here. And honestly, speaking of Jeanette Young, she had big red flags last year as to how she was going to handle this crisis. As far back as April last year, she said to the Brisbane Times that even though she didn't really need to shut the schools because they weren't high-risk spreading environments, she did it anyway because, to quote her, she said, sometimes it's not just about the science and the health, it's about the messaging. Now, if that wasn't a giant red flag as to how she and Anastasia Palaszczuk were going to politicise the heck out of this COVID stuff in Queensland, then I don't know what was.
Exactly. And we saw it here, James. We saw it with Gladys saying that actually, a lot of the police measures have to be tough. That's to help the police, the curfews and so on. That's to help the police. There's nothing to do. There's no medical information there. But James, also New York, your hometown, some restaurateurs there have been smart enough to say, you know what? It's not our job to go around mandating vaccines for people. What do you think of that?
This is the most fascinating thing that's happening right now, because what we're seeing is, I think some of the bigger name restaurateurs, and I think we're going to see that in Australia as well, are really, really keen to actually have some sort of, vaccine passport system where they just check people in and out. But what's really interesting is that smaller restaurants, independent ones, are much less eager to do this. Now, there's a number of reasons why. I mean, a big restaurant chain can obviously have the infrastructure to be checking passports and have whatever equipment that they need to do that in the computer systems. Harder for the smaller operators, already doing it tough. But another thing, too, is that vaccine take-up rate in the U.S. is far lower among minority communities. And what they're saying is, well, look, if we operate in, a minority neighborhood, if that's our community that we serve, we are doing, half our community out of the chance to come and buy a meal with us, serve a meal to them, enjoy our, time with them. And so this is going to be, I think, a huge, huge challenge. And the corporate versus little guy side to this is, I think, the real unexplored aspect to it, which we're going to see a big, big fight over. I don't know how these little guys are going to stand up to the, whoever's the administration in New York now, not Cuomo. But this is going to be the next big fight. Again, we have to watch it here, because you do anything like this, it becomes permanent. And then, people are doing this 5-10 years from now, and it's just another barrier to entry, both to the business and for those who actually want to enter the business.
Well, it's not just the cafes and restaurants. It's also, of course, small businesses like gyms that worry about this sort of thing. But someone who's worked out how to use a gym, or who's struggling to work out how to use a gym, are, of course, the Taliban, who have arrived in Kabul and been confronted with the presidential palace or whatever it is. And here they are in the gym trying to figure out how to make it work.
एयरपोर्ट नामनी कमंदानी एकेडमी हेडक्वार्टर राजक में
They look even worse in the gym than I do, Daisy and James. What did you make of that, Daisy?
Look, it's kind of objectively amusing to see these dreadful people looking so completely stupid, not knowing how to work this gym equipment and swinging around on stuff. It's morbidly fascinating. But the thing is, the perverse thing about it is that they're obviously having fun. They are having fun storming through Afghanistan and sticking it to America and sticking it to the West and reveling in their victory and what Joe Biden just handed to them on a silver platter. And that should be a massive indictment of Joe Biden and the USA. The fact that these Taliban people are just reveling in all of this is expected, but quite frankly, disgusting. It is a massive indictment on the USA that they have allowed this to happen. And on top of all the other embarrassment they should definitely be feeling, they should look at this and feel incredibly terrible about themselves, more than they do already, because it is the most horrendous situation, as we can all agree, and a massive indictment on the US.
Well, James, you're going to be talking more about the Biden's disastrous approach to this, and we will be speaking to Mike Doran later on in the show. He was, of course, in the George Bush's Defense Department. He was an advisor there on defense, so he's got a lot to say on that. But, James, give us your thoughts. I was confused to hear that the US press reporting that the Taliban, because the US press can't work out whether the Taliban are the good guys or bad guys, they seem to think that they're going to be a woke new 2.0 Taliban. But apparently they were chanting death to America in a friendly fashion.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is exactly the same sort of reporting we've seen, about these terrorist savages since 9/11, which is, maybe we need to get to know them. Maybe they're not such bad guys after all. And, you remember those famous columns after September 11, 20 years ago, the old, why do they hate us? Why do they hate us? As the rocks went flying at the correspondent's head. But this was, I think it was CNN. And, these days you don't know whether it's the Babylon Bee or CNN anymore. But they said, look, they were chanting death to America, but it was in a really friendly manner. Now, I mean, this is the thing, though. Like, we can laugh about all of these things and, them not being able to work the gym equipment. And frankly, I can't work gym equipment either. So,
No,
whatever. But, I know, right?
On.
Look at me. I mean, come on, guys. Look, I regard those as just torture instruments, just as
Maybe
they do.
Maybe they're going to use them for torture instruments.
Exactly
Maybe
right,
that's the plan.
Yeah, Mullah Omar, your personal trainer, coming soon to a gym near you, But no, look, this is just an absolute debacle. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. I'll be talking about this more after the break. But the Biden administration has suffered an incomprehensible humiliation that is as bad as anything, certainly at least since Saigon. They have basically handed the country back to these savages, knowing that this was going to happen. All the intelligence reports said, if you pull out, this is what's going to happen. They did it in entirely the wrong order. They left allies completely in the dark, to the point where the UK Parliament actually voted to condemn the Biden administration for their handling of this. The British military is now doing a better job getting Americans who are stranded in Afghanistan out of Afghanistan than the US military is, which is an absolute disgrace that there could possibly be American civilians left behind in this whole mess that's been created by the vacuum that the Biden administration has left. Women who have spoken up against the Taliban are being tortured already. They're going house to house. Journalists, anybody who worked with the old regime is bound for the hangman's noose or worse. This is just an absolute disaster. And the bigger disaster is, of course, China is looking at this and rubbing its hands. Russia is watching this and rubbing their hands and having a shot of vodka. They are looking at this and saying, you can't, American allies, you can't trust Russia, can't trust America. The China Daily, or the Global Times of China, the day after Afghanistan fell, had 3 articles on their homepage saying, well, look at this, Taiwan. How much do you trust your American allies now?
Yeah, exactly.
The signal is clear. I think within a year, China makes a play for Taiwan. And I think it's pretty predictable what's going to happen. The U.S. is going to say, well, enjoy it.
Absolutely. Well, the Taliban will be allowed to stay on Twitter so long as they don't glorify violence, Twitter has told us. But of course, Donald Trump ain't allowed on Twitter. And we also know that Hollywood stars are rushing around comparing the Taliban to American conservatives, of course. But we'll be taking a short break now. We'll be back. We've got Campbell Newman, who's going to give us that Lib Dems Freedom Day in a tick.
Hello, you're watching Outsiders with Rowan Dean. Special guest host this week, Daisy Cousins. And of course, I'm James Morrow. And thanks, as always, for sharing your Sunday with us. Now, we all know that this has been a horrible week for America, her allies, and freedom lovers everywhere. And it's also been a terrible week for Joe Biden, about whom even Democrats are now starting to say out loud what we have been saying on this program for more than a year. What has happened in Afghanistan represents the worst humiliation the U.S. has suffered since the fall of Saigon or the Iran hostage crisis. But what is more disturbing is how Joe Biden reacted to this debacle, a debacle entirely of his own making.
Bushwhacking, hornswoggling, Kroger is gonna roll away, biscuit cutter.
Now, who can argue with that?
Oh, wait, sorry. That wasn't the President of the United States giving confused, angry justifications for his failure in Kabul. That was Gabby Johnson from Blazing Saddles. Our mistake. Here's the President.
We've all seen the pictures. We've seen those hundreds of people packed into a C-17. We've seen Afghans falling.
That was 4 days ago, 5 days ago.
What did you think when you first saw those pictures?
What I thought was we have to gain control of this.
4 or 5 days ago? Actually, sorry, Mr. President, that occurred just 2 days before the president tried to justify himself to American ABC's George Stephanopoulos. But that's what you get when your commander-in-chief keeps track of the days by what color ice cream they serve him after dinner. Here's a bit more from the interview. You tell me if you can understand what he's saying.
When you look at what's happened over the last week, was it a failure of intelligence, planning, execution, or judgment?
Look, I don't think it was a fair. Look, it was a simple choice, George. When the Taliban, let me put it another way. When you had the government of Afghanistan, the leader of that government getting in a plane and taking off and going to another country, when you saw the significant collapse of the Afghan troops we had trained, up to 300,000 of them, just leaving their equipment and taking off. That was, that's what happened. That's simply what happened.
Excuse me, Mr. President, would you like some dressing with your word salad? That interview went on with, among other things, the president claiming that he was never warned that the Afghan government was about to collapse, meaning he was either engaging in a massive act of gaslighting or, just as likely, he simply forgot. And there have been reports that ABC actually cut some of the worst part of that interview, making that the best he had to offer. Now, look, I'm going to be frank here. It's one thing to joke about Joe Biden's verbal miscues and corn pop memories. But the fact is, there's just something not right with the guy. Instead of coming out and owning this crisis, a crisis of his own making, Joe Biden spent the week cowering at Camp David. After the collapse of Afghanistan, Biden vanished for 2 days, only returning briefly to read a speech off a teleprompter and take no questions. Tuesday this week was also a wash, with the president not to be seen. On Wednesday, he read another script, this time about vaccine boosters off a teleprompter. Again, with no questions from the press. When he did make an appearance Friday, it was to blatantly lie and claim that Americans abandoned by their government and trying to get out of Afghanistan were having no trouble at all getting to the airport. Does he really think it's just a matter of accepting the surge charge on a Kabul Uber to get out of there? Look, you get the idea. Where is the guy? And what is going on with him? It's no wonder that in Washington, rumors are beginning to churn about Biden's mental capacity and even using the 25th Amendment of the Constitution to remove him from office. But there's only one problem. Who would take his place? If you thought the obvious answer was Kamala Harris, well, not so fast. Yes, the word around Washington is that she has been sniffing around to see whether she could whip the support she needs among the cabinet. But if Democrats think that if there's a less appealing prospect than sticking with Joe Biden for 3 more years, it's putting Kamala Harris, a woman whose ambition exists in direct opposition to her ability, in his place. Plus, there's this. In the last election, the U.S. Senate went 50-50. Harris, in a role not just as vice president, but president of the Senate, is the deciding vote in that body. If she becomes president, then not only the Democrats lose control of the upper house, but they also lose their 51st vote to confirm a new vice president as required by the Constitution. So, unless Biden's decline becomes even more dramatic and harder to hide, and let's not count that out, The Democrats are stalemated on this one. Sadly, the rest of the world is now too.
Well, this week a book was launched in Australia called Australian Perspectives on Transgendering Children and Adolescents by Jeff Holloway. You can download a PDF from Facebook, and the book was sent to all our health ministers and other politicians last week with a letter calling for a national inquiry into transgender medical treatments on children. The book is written by experts from all sorts of backgrounds, including paediatrics, psychiatry and the law, questioning the long-term consequences of medical gender transitioning. I spoke to one Australian mum this week who told me the heartbreaking story about her daughter, who has a long history of mental health issues, who fell in with one of these transgender organisations. The mum describes it as worse than a cult, who convinced the girl the answer to all her problems was to turn into a boy. And all the way along, the mum was sneered at by the medical profession for questioning the process. This is a disgrace. The family has been torn apart. The mum has been ostracised from her daughter, now supposedly her son. And when the mum spoke to one surgeon, this will sicken you, he admitted that 10 years ago he would never have, quote, chopped a girl's breasts off, but now it is all too common, unquote. This is out of control. We need a national inquiry to determine that the medical profession is properly regulated when it comes to transgenderism and our children. Scott Morrison, Greg Hunt, get onto it right now. Well, he's well known to Sky viewers and Outsiders viewers. He left the Liberal Party a couple of weeks ago, joined the Liberal Dems, and they have now their policy platform announced on their website. Welcome back to Outsiders, Campbell Newman. How are you, mates?
G'day, Rowan, James, Daisy. Thanks for having me.
OK, hit us with the big news. You've got Freedom Day. I've done a spoiler alert. Freedom Day, December 4th.
Okay.
Kick it off. Tell us all about it.
Well, probably that's the place to start. But just a word before that, I have never been so concerned about our nation's future, and that's why I left the Liberal Party, because they didn't stand up for freedom, for small business, for small government, for balanced budgets, for keeping debt under control. That's why I've left. And sorry, Tony Abbott and Gerard Henderson. I've tried very hard to work from within, but you know what? If no one's listening, and indeed if they're actually telling you to resign or trying to vote you off the executive, there's not much you can do. But I'll move on. So I've joined the Lib Dems, and you know what? I've found my soulmates. These are people who believe in personal responsibility and believe in the values of freedom and liberty. So our policy, which is on our website today, is all about a very clear, very straightforward plan to get us out of this COVID mess. So it really starts, I suppose, with a number of initiatives we can do right now. But going to Freedom Day, we're saying that by the 4th of December this year, according to all the stuff we're hearing from our political leaders, anybody who wants a vaccine in this nation will have been able to get it. And I'm talking about access there, freedom of choice. And on that day, having told people about the benefits and the risks, etc., and the protection that a vaccine may offer you to COVID-19, and I've certainly had mine, we then have to open up. We're going to open up the borders, no vaccine passports, no coercion in the workplace of being vaccinated, the kids back at schools, and life getting back to normal. And that's what it's all about. And, frankly, we have to live with COVID-19. It's a dangerous disease, but it's best managed in the way that I've just said, because what we're not doing is taking into account all the negatives. I mean, we heard in the last week about, sadly, 8 teenage girls in Victoria committing suicide in the first 7 months of this year compared to only 1 last year. Huge increases in self-harm and presentation at hospitals. But anyway, that's the gist of it, guys.
Daisy.
Well, Campbell, I was looking at your policy and I noticed that it says you think lockdown should never have been implemented in the first place. I cannot agree with you enough. Bravo. Thank God someone in the political class is saying it, at least outside of the major 2 parties. Now, you mentioned that you'd be phasing out the lockdowns on the way to Freedom Day. What would this phasing out look like?
Well, just on lockdowns work if you're only measuring one thing, which is one metric, one measure, which is just COVID cases. But let's ignore the fact that there are kids committing suicide. And by the way, the Daniel Andrews government seems to be suppressing information on mental health issues. There's the businesses that have folded. There's the livelihoods have been smashed. There are people protesting because they've lost their jobs and they see no future. So what we're saying is the lockdowns are a blunt instrument that are smashing Australia and our freedoms and our liberty. What we need to do is start to unravel this. We need our politicians to admit, Daisy, they have dug themselves into a hole, well, 3/4 of the way to actually Red China. And I mean that quite tellingly. That's how far they've gone in terms of the liberties. They've dug a hole, they need to get out. They need to stand up in the coming weeks, apologise, say they've got this wrong, tell us the truth that we have to live with this. And actually, in areas where they can, they start to unravel this. They start to phase out. So in regional areas, say of New South Wales, where there are not big problems with COVID right now, they need to get the vaccine in there and get those communities opened up and gradually, progressively unravel this mess. But again, on the 4th of December, going on their metrics about vaccine rollout and accessibility, not compulsion, accessibility to vaccines, at that point, you've had your opportunity. It's up to you as an individual if you wish to protect yourself, but we're opening up.
James.
Campbell, I want to ask you two things very quickly. Number one, do you think that the government with its 4-phase plan, which of course could be blown up at any moment by any rogue premier, is going to encourage vaccine hesitancy when it says that even if you hit 80%, we could still be seeing lockdowns and restrictions? And I want to ask you about the Liberal Democrats. People have associated them in the past with kind of a fringe party or a libertarian party that's concerned with things like drug legalization, things like that. Is this a new Liberal Democrats that we're seeing? And what will be your big issues beyond COVID after the pandemic?
Well, to answer your first question, James, the problem with what the government's put forward is absolutely, as you've said it, why would you bother if there's going to continue to be lockdowns? Why would you bother to be vaccinated? I mean, my wife and I have been vaccinated, but we're still living as prisoners. We can't leave Australia. We can't visit relatives overseas. We can't even go to blooming Sydney right now and see friends and relatives. It's just ridiculous. And, we know all the stories about people across the New South Wales, Queensland border on the Gold Coast. So that's why the Lib Dems policy is quite different. It is real differentiation here because we're saying it's about personal choice. It's not about an arbitrary target. The target of vaccination take up, it is a target for accessibility. Once 100% of Australians have had the chance to have the shot, at that point, knowing the risks, knowing the benefits, it's time to open up. To answer your second question about the Lib Dems, look, I'm actually a libertarian. Probably that was my natural home. I have spoken in the past 6 years about the need for a better position on drugs in this country. It was in the Courier Mail in January 2019. I wrote an op-ed piece. People can see it's on the public record. Similarly, I've been a supporter of voluntary assisted dying. The Lib Dems supported gay marriage. That's something I supported 10 years ago. Apparently, I was the first Conservative leader in this nation to support it when I was the leader of the opposition of the LNP in Queensland. But my point is this is going to be a mainstream party, but with strong values and beliefs of personal liberty and freedom and a commitment to small government. We're about personal responsibility. And so really we're on a crusade. We're on a crusade to save Australia. And I hope people watching today can join the Lib Dems because together we are going to knock the political class in this country, the Liberal Party who won't listen anymore, the Labor Party have gone too far left and don't represent working people. We're going to knock them off their perches. We're going to deal with the people living in the gilded Versailles of Canberra in their Parliament House. And we're actually going to bring real leadership back to Canberra and we're going to restore the Australian way, the things we've lost in the last 18 months.
Campbell Newman, thanks so much for coming on Outsiders. I noticed point number 3 on your policy platform there is peaceful protests must be allowed. Who'd have thought even a year ago that we would ever be saying that in an Australian political manifesto? Congratulations, good luck, and I'm sure Outsiders will be looking on the Liberal Dem website to study those policies very closely. Thanks, Campbell Newman. See you, mate.
Thanks, Steve.
Coming up, we've got lots more. We've got Mike Doran, who's going to tell us all about what is happening with Afghanistan. And Daisy's got her editorial as well. You don't want to miss that in a tick. You're watching Outsiders with James Morrow, Daisy Cousins filling in for Rita, and myself, Rowan Dean. And thank you so much for watching us every Sunday morning. We do appreciate you being there. Well, last week's Q&A on the ABC was devoted to the events in Afghanistan following the fall of Kabul to Taliban forces. And appearing on the panel was Diana Syed, human rights lawyer, CEO of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights, and a regular on the ABC. And she was demanding the Australian government take action to rescue Afghans.
And we've just saw the open letter that we signed on behalf of almost 10,000 people signed calling on the Morrison government to increase its intake. This is 3,000, that's already our existing humanitarian intake. We need an emergency intake of an additional 20,000 visas to be granted to Afghans immediately.
And Syed had a warning for those who would even suggest that this should be conditional on their undergoing security vetting.
I just would caution these sorts of buying into the narrative that somehow, it's a very racist colonial trope that is deeply rooted in Islamophobia. And so there is a lot that we can do. Don't buy into the security lens narrative, the fear-mongering and the dog whistling to people saying that Afghans are X, Y, and Z.
That's right. Security vetting is a racist, colonial, Islamic trope driven by fear-mongering and dog whistling.
Now, we don't deny that there are many desperate and worthy Afghans who should be given safe haven, but we do wonder why Syed would want to bring them to the oppressive and cruel country that is Australia. What was she saying only last year?
People are now sort of wakening up to the Black Lives Matter movement and systemic and structural systems of oppression and racism in this country. We've been living it for generations.
Good grief, Australia sounds like such a terrible, terrible place. Last year in an article for the New Arab, Syed wrote, "As an Afghan Australian international human rights lawyer, I have spent over a decade advocating, campaigning and speaking truth to power whenever I possibly could to highlight how Australia enables war crimes in our name every day," quote unquote.
And there's more. She also wrote this, quote, "The reckoning that must come is the acknowledgement that we are a violent state. Our very foundation since colonization has been predicated on violence." And there's more. She also said that we live in a settler colony that inflicts violence upon us every day. We are rotten at our core, and I'm terrified every day living in this colony that the dehumanization of me as an Afghan Muslim woman means that I don't matter. Yes, doesn't matter so much, she even goes on Q&A. Think of the atrocities this poor woman has suffered at the hands of her colonial oppressors. To have an example.
And I'm constantly having to work so much harder to get ahead in life, having to, continue to pay my HECS, and I'm into my 30s now, so I didn't have parents who could pay them up front. And I worry about communities that are from disadvantaged backgrounds like myself.
Not only do the oppressors make you pay HECS, they also make you do the census. Earlier this month, Syed tweeted, "Getting ahead of #Census21 to let you all know how deep internalized Islamophobia is in this colony. When I was 16, I asked my #Afghan #Muslim Baba which box I should tick under the religion question. His first look was panic before he told me to tick other. He was legit afraid."
When Syed called last week for a mass intake of Afghan refugees, she also stressed the importance of protecting minorities.
About other at-risk groups, ethnic minorities, LGBTQI and others.
But remember in 2015 when then Prime Minister Tony Abbott offered to take thousands of refugees from the Syrian conflict? Here's what Syed said about that.
that they would take in 12,000 Syrian refugees of minority status. Now, from a majority Muslim country, that reads that they would have to be of Christian background. Again, they are, wanting to promote a white Australia policy, essentially.
So, just to confirm, taking Afghan minorities such as LGBTQI is a good thing. But if you grant asylum to Christians from the Middle East, the most dangerous place in the world to be a Christian, you're perpetuating the White Australia policy. Is everyone clear now?
Now, Syed most likely owes her life to Australia, having been granted asylum here along with her parents. You'd think there would be at least a skerrick of gratitude, but apparently not.
Essentially, have all said on the panel here today is that Muslim lives don't matter. And that is exactly what I've said.
That's not fair.
That's what people are hearing at home, they're hearing in the audience, and that is just so heartbreaking. We did not choose for this war to happen. It's an imperialist intervention that was unlawful in 2001 following 9/11.
Yes, it was an imperialist intervention to displace the great humanitarian himself, Osama bin Laden. I must admit, I'm very confused. She bemoans the West's intervention in 2001, which defeated the Taliban, and now she bemoans the fact that the Taliban has returned to power, and she insists now that it's the West's problem to rectify. So, what was she saying last year?
We just need to be sort of allowed the space to self-determine our own lives. And there are some really harmful sort of white saviour narratives.
Well, Diana Syed, we hope that those Afghan refugees who are given safe passage to this country have children who grow up to be loyal Australian citizens who love their country, as opposed to becoming entitled princesses who make a living out of perpetuating victimhood and biting the hands that feed them. What was it you tweeted just a few weeks ago? Can you tell I'm desperado to get off this penal colony island to be reunited with mi familia?
Desperate to leave this colonial hellhole. Good news, Diana. The imperialists have now left Afghanistan. Sounds like the perfect bolt hole to me. Well, Wackademia, the wacky world of academia. James, a professor was condemned as racist. For what? Yes, well, this is great. And by the way, I just wonder if Diana's going to join the Lib Dems now that, they've also got this open border policy to let her go. But this was in San Jose State University. A professor in the anthropology department was condemned by her chair as being his racist colleague and doing something that was very, very disturbing to other classmates, professors. What was that? Well, she said that when you're searching for research, it doesn't matter what the race of the person who did the research that you're citing is, as long as it's the best research you can get to support the case you're trying to make. Now, apparently, this is the bizarro world that we're in American academia and increasingly Australia. If you are not racist, then that means that what you have to do is take race into account. But if you don't take race into account, then you're racist. Racist. Yes. Perfect circle. The perfect. You cannot win. Daisy, tell us about this chemistry teacher who lost a job.
Well, this chemistry teacher from the state of Utah has found herself out of a job after she delivered this bizarre, stumbling, leftist political-laden rant to her high school students, covering all things from climate change to how much she just really hates Donald Trump.
I hate Donald Trump. I'm going to say it. I don't care what y'all think. Trump sucks. He is a sexual predator. He's a literal moron. Go title only to the freaking admin. They don't give a crap. No, he is not. What are you talking about? Turn off the Fox News. Do your parents listen to Fox News? Most of y'all parents are dumber than you. You can believe what you want to believe, but keep it quiet in here because I'm probably going to make fun of you.
Unbelievable. Let's grab some more lefty lunacy. Well, Daisy and James, remember Chris Bowen during the last election? He told Labor voters, don't vote Labor if you don't like our policies, which they all went, yep, we don't like your policies. Nope, we're not going to vote for Labor. It worked. Well, Matt Keane, the New South Wales Energy Minister, has updated the Bowen manifesto. He is telling people, he's urging voters that if you have concerns or are worried about the climate crisis, you must send a message at the ballot box. Great advice, Matt Keane. We're urging all true Liberals, all Conservatives, everybody out there, send a message and vote against the New South Wales Liberal Party so long as Matt Keane is there, and send the message at the ballot box that you will not accept the loss of your jobs, the loss of your children's prosperity. You don't want to sit in the darkness in years to come with an electric car that doesn't work. Send the message at the ballot box. James and Daisy, do you agree?
Well, this is exactly the problem that the New South Wales Liberals have. They're being colonized by these moderates, and I use that word advisedly, who are really just light green, inner city cashed up classes that want to turn the Liberals into sort of, another version of the Greens and kick out. They actually are more interested in fighting Conservatives than they are in fighting, people to their left, Labor, the Greens. Do not be surprised when two things happen at the next election. Number one, the Gladys Berejiklian government gets absolutely smashed. And number two, if people like Matt Keane, who are sending people to go vote for One Nation, the Lib Dems, Shooters and Fishers, and all sorts of minor parties where they feel like they do not have a home in the majors, just gets absolutely steamrolled at the next election. The Labour only has to flip, I think, 1 or 2 seats to get it. So, if I was Chris Minns, the opposition leader right now, I'd be rubbing my hands together with glee.
And Daisy, just quickly before we go, General Motors, apparently they've recalled all their electric cars because they don't work, correct?
That seems to be the case. Yes, General Motors, there's apparently a problem with the batteries on some of these cars due to some sort of rare manufacturing error that causes them to overheat and burst into flame.
Who'd have picked it? Excellent. We've got to take a break.
Indeed.
We've got to take a break. Coming up, who'd have ever picked it? Coming up, lots more. I'll be talking about Boris Johnson and his climate change promises in a tick. Hello, you're watching Outsiders with James Morrow, Daisy Cousins and myself, Rowan Dean. Well, if there's one thing scarier than rising sea levels, it's being drowned in an ocean of rising stupidity. Just listen to this dangerous fool.
We in the UK, I'm afraid to say we were the first. We were the beginners of the crime. We started, the Industrial Revolution began in this country. We began this huge pattern of hydrocarbon emissions long before other countries that are way behind us on the pathway to development. We owe it to them to support them now in accelerating their move to net zero. It's not fair otherwise.
The Industrial Revolution was a crime? Yes, that's the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Boris Johnson, a starker example of the idiocy of unctuous, hypocritical, hand-wringing virtue signalling, and the self-loathing of the modern Western elites would be harder to come by. First of all, it is thanks to the Industrial Revolution that billions of human beings have been lifted out of poverty, disease, malnutrition, and living lives that, before the Industrial Revolution, were accurately described by the philosopher Thomas Hobbes as nasty, brutish and short. For Boris Johnson to demonise the achievements in medicine, science, education, transportation, construction, habitation, refrigeration, distribution of wealth and protection of human lives that was gifted to all humanity by the British Empire and the Industrial Revolution is an absolute disgrace. And to then suggest that the hard-working men and women and families of modern Britain and countries like Australia should sacrifice our hard-earned prosperity and the wonderful opportunity that is the birthright of all of us in the name of some ludicrous woke concept called fairness to late developing nations is as grotesque as it is deadly dangerous. Here is a graph showing global carbon emissions in 2019. As you can see, if you look closely, Britain doesn't even feature on the chart, nor indeed does Australia. as has in fact been pointed out many times, including by Australia's chief scientist, Alan Finkel, to our Senate, we could eliminate all of Australia's carbon emissions tomorrow, and it would not make a jot of difference to reducing global temperatures ever.
I didn't put those propositions to you. I simply asked a question. If we reduce the world's carbon emissions by 1.3%, what impact would that have on the changing climate of the world?
Virtually nothing.
In that same discussion, back in 2017, the role of China's carbon emissions was also discussed.
With all due respect to the Chinese, and I love them, they talk a lot about climate change, but they do very little. They open a new coal-fired power station each week. India, I think, is India a signatory to Paris, or...?
They are, but China in particular, I'm not sure about India, they've got a different set of commitments to what the OECD countries and Australia have made.
Ah, yes, a different set of commitments. I think that's what you might call the understatement of the century. Under the Paris Agreement, China is free to increase its emissions to whatever, to billio, for the rest of the decade, and not even pretend to get to net zero until a decade after everybody else has got there in 2060 or whenever. Indeed, just last week, according to the Global Warming Policy Foundation, China's climate envoy Xi Zhenhua made it clear that China will refuse to accept any changes to the Paris Agreement that might be canvassed at Boris Johnson's craven COP26 Climate Cult Fest in Glasgow in November, meaning they will simply refuse to abide by any attempts to get China to do what we're doing and reducing our emissions, which is why, presumably, last week, with all the IPCC hyperbole about rising sea levels and storms and bushfires and the imminent climate apocalypse, Chinese media desperately downplayed China's role in climate change. According to the Daily Mail, although Chinese state media did cover the IPCC's Code Red climate report and covered all of the dire warnings and urged the rest of the world on the need for global action, funnily enough, none of the Chinese media made any mention of China's own huge carbon emissions and the fact that they are by far the world's largest carbon emitter. Now, why would that be? Perhaps the Chinese media have other more important priorities at the moment, such as, inventing bogus Swiss scientists to help cover up the origins of the coronavirus, the virus that escaped from one of their biotech biotech research labs before conveniently landing in a bowl of baby bat soup and then being accidentally exported around the world as Chinese tourists flocked to Europe for the 2019 Chinese New Year's celebrations. Indeed, as the website China Travel News reported excitedly all the way back as far back as May of 2018, 64% of Chinese surveyed had decided to head overseas for the 2019 New Year's celebrations, and the top 5 most popular overseas destinations for Chinese high-end travellers were Europe, 39%, the Americas, 36%, Africa, 29%, Southeast and Southeast Asia, 23%, and Japan and South Korea, 22%. Lucky them! At least those high-end Chinese travellers, at least the coronavirus didn't interfere with their holiday plans, unlike the rest of us who are now enjoying up to our 6th lockdown thanks to COVID-19. But I digress. As Judith Bergman reported recently on the Gatestone Institute website, 5 years ago, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, in a legally binding decision known as the South China Sea Arbitration Case, ruled emphatically against Communist China's claims to sovereignty over much of the South China Sea. Yet, the Chinese government's position on that legally binding ruling is clear. They simply refuse to accept or even acknowledge it. Not exactly what you might call good global citizens. So, just to be clear, Communist China refuses to reduce its emissions, despite whatever the rest of the world thinks. Communist China demands that the rest of the world urgently reduce our emissions, even if we can't afford to. And Communist China ignores the international rule of law that says it can't take whatever it wants of the South China Sea. What could possibly go wrong? Well, here's former US Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, who some believe may run for president in 2024 on the Republican ticket, explaining recently why she wants the West to boycott the Beijing Winter Olympics.
When this Beijing Olympics happens, they are planning that this is going to be them showing the world that they are the new superpower of the world. And you mark my words, after that Olympics, if everything goes smooth, they're going to take Taiwan. And when they take Taiwan, it's over. It's over.
Nikki Haley also spoke of what she calls the genocide of the Muslim Uyghurs, and then made this warning.
They already tried it with Hong Kong to see if anybody was going to do anything. And we didn't really do anything. If they take Taiwan, then it's not about their region anymore. Then they're going to just go start taking other places. Then you're going to start seeing them eat up other countries. Even though they can't lay claim to them, they will. And that's the danger of it. Then you go a step further. They have, invested in all of these little properties. These are frivolous infrastructure projects that they're doing. They do it in these little countries waiting for such a time as this, when COVID hits, run up the debt, and then they say, you can't pay it back. Give us your military installation. Give us your port. Give us your utility. Now you look at that map, it'll send a chill up your spine.
Too late, Nikki. We've already given our most northern port to China. Here you go, the port of Darwin. There you go. Anyway, back to Boris Johnson and climate change. The British Prime Minister says the developing world, which includes China, should be allowed to carry on emitting carbon to their heart's content while we in the West shut down all our carbon emitting industries and manufacturing. But what could all those coal-fired factories the length and breadth of China be producing? I mean, I presume Boris is hoping the communists will just carry on manufacturing our smart TVs and iPhones for us. After all, what else could the Chinese possibly have in mind?
They are now building up their military. They have the largest naval fleet in the world. They have more air defense systems. They're modernizing their military. We're not.
Boris Johnson and all those who will gather in Glasgow for COP26, including our own Prime Minister Scott Morrison, want you to sacrifice your job and your children's future prosperity while China carries on brazenly flouting international laws and doing everything it can to turn itself into an industrial megapower with the world's largest and most powerful military. This is totally unacceptable, and which is why I call on Scott Morrison and Angus Taylor to insist that from now on, Australia will only reduce our carbon emissions following and in direct proportion to verifiable reductions in China's overall carbon emissions. Otherwise, we should refuse to participate in COP26 because it is clearly not in our national interest. Boris Johnson and the treacherous woke climate cult believe that the Industrial Revolution was a crime. You heard it. And we must all be punished for it. Not since Neville Chamberlain stepped onto the tarmac waving his tatty scrap of German foolscript notepaper have the people of Britain and the West been betrayed by such a dangerously gullible fool. Well, Michael Doran, great friend of Outsiders, former defence and Middle East advisor to the Bush administration and senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. And prior to that, he was at the Brookings Institution as an expert on Middle East politics. In a Foreign Affairs article he wrote, called Somebody Else's Civil War, Mike wrote, he argued that September 11th attacks were part of a religious conflict within the Muslim world and that Osama bin Laden, hoping the US retaliation would unite the faithful against the West, sought to spark revolutions in Arab nations and elsewhere, and that war with America was never the end result, but was just a means to promote radical Islam. Mike, welcome back to Outsiders. How are you?
Oh, wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Now, do you still agree with the analysis of that brilliant man there that I just quoted, Mike Doran himself? Your thoughts?
Oh, thanks. Well, I wrote that about 20 years ago, but I think it holds up well. At the time, everybody was arguing about, why do they hate us? And I made the point that it's not that they hate us, it's that they're fighting each other and they want to use the conflict with us to gain power over each other. I'm not sure that we have fully absorbed all that means, but I think the peace holds up. But unfortunately, they're succeeding at the moment in Kabul. Those images coming out of Afghanistan are really disheartening, as I'm sure you agree.
So, Mike, tell us your take on Afghanistan, Biden's culpability, Trump's culpability. Tell us the big picture and what your fears or hopes for the future.
Well, Biden is absolutely culpable. I mean, this is happening on his watch. But I think that we can all see that the will of the American people to fight that war is flagging. And that was already expressing itself through Trump. I don't believe Biden is saying that his hands are tied by the agreement that Trump made, and that Donald Trump would have done the same thing. I don't actually think that's true. I watched very closely in the Middle East while Trump pulled back and then took actions like killing Qasem Soleimani. Trump likes to win. Trump is very concerned about images like we're seeing coming out of Kabul right now. So it's true that Trump wanted to withdraw, but I don't think he would have withdrawn in this wholly shambolic manner, which is really detrimental to the prestige of the United States and indeed of the entire West. But we do have to absorb the fact that the American public no longer has the will to fight this war. I think this is the sad truth. I wish that we had defined our goals in Afghanistan much more clearly, in a way that the American people could get behind. But that hasn't happened. We're not going to reverse this. We have to move on from here. And the big question here, there's, of course, the fact that this is going to be a shot in the arm for radical Islam, no doubt about that, radical Islam globally. But also the world has changed now. Pakistan and China are allies. They're both of them are going to be using the Taliban to project power against India. This is going to have great ramifications for Central Asia. And the United States and the West in general, we have to get in the game of the great power competition game around Afghanistan, which we're really just not playing at the moment.
James.
Well, sure, Mike. I mean, you say all of that, and I understand that, but let's be honest. We don't wake up every morning and worry if there's going to be some mean tweet sent overnight that's going to start World War III, right? So, I mean, we've got that over the Trump administration. But seriously, though, I want to ask you. You talked about the American people's will to fight, and my concern is, does the Pentagon have the will to fight? Because every week on this show, we talk about stories about how they're becoming, both more woke and more concerned about diversity targets and things like that than having a Navy that can maintain a fleet and, fight its enemies, and is also more interested in, fighting Trump supporters within its own ranks under the name of radicalism. Where is our military? Where's the U.S. military in terms of its warfighting capability, not just in terms of the great game between China and Pakistan, but if things get really kinetic, say, in the Western Pacific?
I still think the core of the military is it's the best in the world, and we have a highly trained and highly experienced military that can carry out the hardest missions in the world. I am, like you, I'm very concerned about the inroads that progressivism is making in the Pentagon, and indeed in every aspect of our life. I mean, they control now, the progressives, the commanding heights of the culture, and they are using that position to try to insert themselves everywhere. Including in the military, but I think there has to be strategically we have to do a mental shift, and when I say we, I mean really all of us. We had these grand experiments in Iraq and Afghanistan that didn't end well, and a lot of people in Washington, I'm concerned about, are continuing to give the same kind of advice. That clearly no president is going to support it. We've now had 3 presidents very different kinds of, very different individuals, very different worldviews from the left and from the right. And all of them have rejected the kinds of projects that we were engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think those of us who want to see a muscular America or an America that's deeply engaged abroad, we have to learn that lesson, and we have to start defining our goals and our strategic goals and our military goals in a much more precise fashion.
Daisy.
Well, Mike, interestingly enough, Prime Minister Bennett of Israel has a meeting scheduled, I believe, this week with Joe Biden. I'm sure Joe Biden is not thrilled about the timing. How do you think that is going to pan out relative to what's just happened in Afghanistan?
Well, actually, I think Biden might welcome this meeting because it's an opportunity for him, after having looked so incompetent last week. It's an opportunity for him to look like he's more of a statesman and in control, because Bennett is in a very odd position domestically in Israel. He's a right-wing politician who's leading a centrist and leftist coalition. I mean, he betrayed his own voters in order to become the prime minister, and so it's very important to him to have the appearance of good relations with Joe Biden, because he has to justify toppling Bibi Netanyahu. And so what he wants to do is say that I am bringing good relations with Washington, something that Netanyahu could never have done because he got too close to Donald Trump. So there's a kind of, both of them have I think both Biden and Bennett have a desire for smiling optics. Now, unfortunately, what that's going to mean on the Israeli side is that they're going to have to capitulate to Biden on the Iran question. It won't be an open capitulation, but the Biden administration is capitulating to Iran. It's engaging Iran all across the region on the ground, and it's trying to get back to the JCPOA. The only reason the Iran nuclear deal, the only reason it hasn't gotten back is because the Iranians aren't willing to take the deal. But now what they're trying to do in Washington is to kind of fudge it and come up with a sort of informal JCPOA. And they want the Israelis to sit down and shut up while they're doing this.
Well, Mike Doran, you mentioned that Donald Trump likes to win. He certainly won on the Abraham Accords, first-time peace in the Middle East. He won on putting the mullahs and the ayatollahs back in their box in Iran, and many other instances. Joe Biden seems to like to lose, so I'm not sure what the future holds for us. But thanks so much for coming on Outsiders, Mike, and giving us your insights. And we'll speak again soon. Thanks, mate.
Thanks for having me. I love to be on the show.
Excellent. Thank you. That's Mike Doran from the US. And coming up, Daisy's editorial. Don't want to miss that in a tick.
Welcome back. You're watching Outsiders. But first, with the amount of flip-flopping our politicians have done over the past 2 months on vaccine targets, lockdowns, and when or if they will allow us to live normally again, it's a wonder they don't have permanent whiplash. However, through all the goalpost shifting, one piece of rhetoric has remained consistent, that they are keeping us safe. Well, forgive me if I'm a little cynical about that assertion, considering the shadow pandemic raging among Australia's teens and children. Australia is in the grips of what can only be termed a youth mental health crisis. It seems clear that this has been brought on partly by continued lockdowns. The Kids Helpline recently released their 6-monthly report, which has revealed a dramatic increase in calls for the counselling service in the first half of this year compared to the same period in 2020. All age cohorts demonstrated an increase in calls. Every age group listed mental health concerns as the top reason for making contact. In addition, self-injury and self-harm has moved into the top 5 reasons for making a call among 15 to 18-year-olds, with an increase of 34% from 1,217 to 1,635 during the first half of 2021. Disturbingly, the helpline answered 1,788 more calls from children and young people related to suicide concerns. That is 69 calls a week. And as if that wasn't enough, Kids Helpline counsellors called ambulances, police or child safety officers for emergency interventions to save 37 children a week who were contemplating taking their own lives, with kids as young as 5 calling for help. That is a jump of 95% from the 19 emergency interventions per week in the first 6 months of 2020 related to suicide attempts. And in total, the organisation prevented 862 suicides among children and teens nationally in the first 6 months of 2021. The situation is particularly bad in Victoria, with an increase of 184% in emergency interventions, 44% of which were in response to an immediate attempt to enact suicide, and 31% were for reports of child abuse. And all of that was before the current spate of lockdowns. Regarding those, Melbourne's mid-July lockdown coincided with the highest number of calls to the Kids Helpline, averaging over 500 a day. As for Sydney's lockdown, that has caused a bump of over 50% in calls to the Kids Helpline in New South Wales, hitting a high of 4,143 calls in the week beginning July 19th. Who knows what the next 6-monthly report from the Kids Helpline will say? Now, these statistics alone should be enough to bring the lockdowns crashing to a halt. I'm sure if you ask those over 70 if they had to choose between assuming a somewhat higher risk of catching COVID and dying and the continued desecration of the minds of their grandkids, the long-term consequences of which are indeed looming, the over 70s would choose the former, especially since most of them have had at least one shot of vaccine. And yet our politicians continue to ignore this tragedy unfolding in front of them or pay mere lip service to it, and only when prompted. Much as they smile and coo and insist they're just keeping us safe, the short-term thinking and pig-headedness of these COVID-0 obsessed political class is enacting intolerable cruelty on the most vulnerable in our society. No amount of mental health services are going to fix this problem while the lockdowns are ongoing. There is only one solution: end the lockdowns now. The future of Australia quite literally depends on it.
Well, we've talked a lot about what has been happening in our various capital cities with anti-lockdown demonstrations, freedom marches, COVID, vaccine passports. Well, someone who has been very outspoken on the matter is the Liberal MP for Mulgoa. She's in the New South Wales Parliament. Her name is Tanya Davies. Welcome to Outsiders. Tanya, how are you?
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's good to be with you.
Well, Tanya, you've certainly been raising your voice. You were in the New South Wales Cabinet. You are no longer. You have spoken out against various aspects of, I guess, the heavy-handedness of the lockdowns, mandatory vaccination, or the suggestion of vaccine passports. Tell us your thoughts.
Well, thank you. Can I just put out there straight away on the record that I'm not an anti-vaxxer. Our children have all had their approved vaccines according to the federal government's childhood immunisation schedule, and I have vaccines when my doctor advises me to do so. And throughout this whole that our government sends us to distribute throughout our community. Now, the issue that I took a stand on was 2 weeks ago when the government came out and said to southwestern and western communities, of which I represent in the parliament, construction and trades can go back to work if you have a vaccine or a medical exemption. If you don't have a vaccine, you cannot go to work and earn an income for your family. So at that point, I believed our government crossed the line, because no government should stand in between a doctor and a patient relationship and say you must have this medical intervention or you cannot earn an income or you cannot put food on the table. That was a step too far, and I have been raising my voice and arguing against that. And the amount of incoming correspondence, the response on Facebook, Instagram, the emails, the phone calls, we have been overwhelmed. We cannot keep up with the number of people crying out in agreement with what I've been saying and asking for more time, for more options, asking for more information on what these vaccines actually contain, asking for just help and time. Respect us. We just want more information. And yet the government is, at this point in time, ignoring their pleas and their cries for help. And I can't stay silent anymore. I cannot just be a voice of this mantra. It is against everything I stand for as a Liberal. We believe in the inalienable rights of people and their freedoms. Yet here is a government saying to my community, you must have this vaccination or you cannot earn an income for your family. Businesses are at incredible stress as to what is the liability upon them if they force their employees to have a vaccine and something goes wrong. What's the liability? There's no answers to this. And there are people now that are saying, look, we just have to shut up shop. We cannot do this to our workers. We just have to close our business. And families are saying to each other, look, you get the jab, I won't. In case something happens to you, at least I'm here that will earn an income for our family. This is the sort of anxiety and stress that coercion and forced vaccine mandate is having on my community in Western Sydney.
James.
If parents have to vaccinate their kids to send them to daycare so they can go and earn a living, what is the objection to requiring tradespeople to have to get a vaccination themselves to go and earn a living? I'm just sort of trying to figure out why this is different to no jab, no play.
I think the key issue is that the community are saying, look, the jabs that young people get, and as I've said, our children have had, have gone through an extended amount of testing and trials for decades. And people do have concerns, that they just have concerns and questions over this particular vaccine that has been rushed through under emergency use powers. And they're just cautious. They just want more information. And I think as a government, we ought to respect that and we ought to help our community understand and alleviate the concerns they have rather than ignoring their concerns and saying, no, you must have a jab or you can't earn an income.
Fantastic.
And I think
Tanya
the other
Davies.
thing too is just one other point too. This is just targeting southwestern and western Sydney. This mandatory jab is not across the whole board for all construction workers and tradies.
But so just to be clear,
sorry, James, I'll just jump in there.
The vaccine is
sorry,
approved,
Tanya,
though.
sorry, James. Yeah. Tanya, we've got to head off, unfortunately. But Tanya, thank you so much. Obviously, the vaccines are approved by the TGA, etc. So we've got to make that absolutely clear. But if you want more information and you're in Tanya's electorate, or even if you're not, go to Tanya Davies' Facebook page and chat to her there. Tanya, thanks so much for coming on Outsiders. Sorry it's got to be so brief. Next time we'll make sure it's a longer one. Thanks so much and keep well.
Thank you.
And joining us now is a young Conservative male who has fought to be Conservative. He's written a terrific article in The Spectator about being a young Conservative, and shock horror, I mean, how he's white, he's Conservative, he's male, the poor bloke doesn't stand a chance. Aidan Brennan, welcome to Outsiders. How are you?
Hi, Rowan. Thanks for having me on.
Now, listen, Aidan, you were at school last year and you were school captain. We won't go into which school you were in, but you were voted by your classmates as a protest against the wokeness of the teachers. Tell us about it. It's a great story.
Well, it was sort of a classic Outsiders case. When you have an orthodoxy established, as the left have established in, unfortunately, our education and our media and in art, there's a natural appetite to fight back, especially when that orthodoxy is telling young boys that they are oppressors and that they are guilty of sins that happened well before they're born. Of course, they want to vote for someone who wants to stand up against that.
So what happened with the school? What happened with the school? The teachers weren't happy with you being the school captain because you were a clearly Conservative, and you challenged some of the regulations at the school. Tell us about that.
Yes, so we had multiple votes that were without, that's obviously not standard procedure. You have one vote that sort of kept making us vote and they kept getting the same answer. So eventually they had to accept me. And unbelievably, over the few years before I became captain, they'd removed the anthem from our assemblies. They'd stopped putting prayer first and instead had put other things, and that's at a Catholic school. So the fact that I wanted to go in and change that became very controversial somehow. But it was the voice of the students that fought back.
Now, Aidan, I know you're a big fan of Daisy. Daisy is the original conservative turned punk, or punk version of conservative. Daisy, question for Aidan.
Hello, Aidan. So lovely to have you here. Look, just to pick up on what Rowan said, you and I have both talked in our commentary about the concept that conservatism is the new punk. Do you want to just elaborate for the viewers on what that concept means and what it means to you?
So it's about sort of fighting back against what we're told to think. So I think there's a lot of gaslighting from the world's media around what young people think. They constantly say young people are progressive, despite there being very little evidence of that. Greta Thunberg is, of course, held up as the voice of our generation. She's pretty much the exact same age as me, and nobody who's young ever voted for her to be the spokesperson of our generation, but somehow we have to accept that. So a lot of it is just, I'm going to think the exact opposite of what you are telling me to think, even just to spite you. It's not necessarily an intellectual movement, but just fighting back against an orthodoxy like punk had previously in the 1970s.
Aidan Brennan, we've got to leave it there. Thanks so much for coming on. And all grandparents and parents out there is hope. Your kids don't have to be woke. Look at Aidan. And Aidan, well done for standing up for your values. And I think it was you put prayer in front of acknowledgement of country. How dare you? What a radical you are, mate. Thanks so much for coming on Outsiders.
Thanks, guys.
And coming up, the ice is melting in Greenland. I read it in the paper. Ice Age Watch in a tick. You're watching Outsiders with Daisy Cousins joining us, filling in for Rita, and of course James Morrow and myself, Rowan Dean. Well, we talked earlier with Mike Doran, and he made the observation that Donald Trump always liked to win, and I stress again, as we look at, as James has pointed out, the calamity of Biden, let's just remind ourselves that Donald Trump did indeed like to win. As I mentioned, the Abraham Accords, pulling out of Iran. I'm sure he would have done Afghanistan a lot better than this. And in fact, that's what Mike Pompeo says. But James, it's not just us who think that Donald Trump would be doing better. There's a new poll reveals that apparently many voters are now regretting voting for Joe Biden.
And who would blame them, Rowan? I mean, honestly, this is a situation now where we've seen American prestige destroyed on the world stage. The world made a far more dangerous place. And so, there's a big case of what I'm starting to call a phenomenon called Biden's regrets, where Biden voters now say, ooh, gee, maybe the orange man wasn't so bad after all. 1 in 10 regretting their vote. You add the numbers together, that would suggest that Donald Trump, if the election were held today, would still be in office. And it would suggest that even though he did want to end that engagement in Afghanistan, that it would not have been done in such a chaotic and shambolic way.
Daisy?
Well, the poll's pretty interesting. Indeed, it's from Rasmussen Reports, which, remember, is one of the only outlets, along with Trafalgar and the People's Pundit, who were actually even halfway accurate in the last two elections, said that 37% who voted for Joe Biden last time would vote for him today, even though 45% of them said they did. The poll said that 43% of respondents would vote for Trump, so that's quite a big win in the popular vote for Trump if the election were held today. And as James said, nearly 1 in 10 Biden voters regret voting for Joe Biden, which is fairly extraordinary. And if anyone wants a kind of visual representation of that, there's a terrific Twitter account out there called Biden Voters Posting Their L's Online. L's meaning losses. And it is just full of, since the beginning of the year, from the stimulus checks to Afghanistan, tweet after tweet after tweet of Biden voters saying, oh my God, why did I vote for him? What a dummy am I? What a mistake I did make.
Well, the joke is they probably didn't. If you ask me, at least 3 in 10 Biden voters probably never even filled in a ballot. But anyway, that's just my radical, heretical opinion. I know. But anyway, James, we've talked about what, the big question is, how would Donald Trump have handled or Mike Pompeo have handled the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And Donald Trump has likened the way that Biden has done it to the captain jumping ship and then the passengers coming along afterwards, the captain jumping ship before the passengers. What's your thoughts on how Trump may or would have handled the withdrawal, seeing as it was his idea to withdraw in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, look, everybody knew that a long, sustained, decades-long campaign in Afghanistan was not going to work. We knew that Afghanistan, probably the engagement should have ended in 2002, 2003, when the al-Qaeda threat was severely diminished, and America should have gone out, read their history books and said no one profits by staying here for a long time. So to which I say good luck to China on that. But no, there would have been a million things they would have done. They would not have given up American assets so quickly. They would have gotten civilians out first. They would have waited until the so-called fighting season was over and done it in winter. They would have done a million different strategic things differently to avoid what has been essentially the worst outcome. I mean, literally, you had people earlier this week or last week hanging on to the side of C-17 transport planes, hoping to get out of Afghanistan. A certain death outcome. That is how desperate people were to get out of this hellhole that Joe Biden had created by creating this vacuum. His intelligence people told him that it was vulnerable. He lies and say that he doesn't know, or he just doesn't remember, that he doesn't know. Either way, it's just as bad. Now, there's a million ways Trump would have handled this differently.
Now, I just want to talk briefly about January 6th. So that was, of course, the so-called insurrection, the Capitol Hill demonstration, riot, whatever you want to call it. Remember the bloke with the thing on his head, wandering around with the flag and QAnon or whatever all that stuff is about. But what's fascinated me, two things which have happened in the last week, Daisy and James. The first is that you remember back on Outsiders, we actually showed the footage. At the end of that week of January 6th, we showed the footage where you see you can't see his face, but a policeman clearly shoots a woman whose name we found out was Ashley Babbitt. Ashley Babbitt died in the January 6th riot. She didn't appear to be doing anything other than trying to get through a gate when a man with a gun came out of nowhere, shot her, and then disappeared. We've never been told who this man is. There have been various rumours about who he was, but this week we learned the US Capitol cop who shot dead Ashley Babbitt has been exonerated. Nothing to see here. Go away. We will never. He just disappears from history. A woman died. Absolute disgrace. When you look at how the world was torn apart by George Floyd, here's a woman killed at an innocent demonstration and bang. No guilt, nothing. The guy just disappears. We'll never know who he is. James and Daisy, we now learn from the FBI. Daisy, what have we learned?
Well, we've learned from the FBI after they finished their investigation that actually...
OK, sorry, we've got to go live now. We'll take you live to Melbourne, where health authorities are providing a COVID update.